Okay, look, well, welcome to this session. Whether it's morning or afternoon or evening or wherever you are in the world, this is session A, track A7, and the title is Impacts of a Digital Age. In this session, we have 3 presentations. We were scheduled to have 4, but we have 3. So what I'm suggesting is that we can be a little bit sort of more flexible on the time scale. But when you get to around about 20 minutes, I'll signal with my hand or something. I'm not going to try changing screens or whatever. And then, but we will have, means that we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So if you can try and keep the time as best as possible, that would be really good. So as I mentioned, we have 3 presentations. The first one from Andrew Knight and Professor Mohammed Gamal Abdelman. Then we will have Ify Lee. And I think yours is technically with another colleague, Rufeng Yang, is that right? But you're doing the presentation, okay? And then we have Esin Izoglu from France, who's going to do the last presentation. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Knight, who's the Dean of the School of Architecture, Design and Built Environment at Nottingham Trent University, and Professor Gamal Abdelmouen, who's Professor in the Department of Architecture as well at NTU. I've got no profile on you, Gamal, here. So, and I'm sure you don't want to give me I won't give you a personalized profile here. But anyway, I'd like to sort of give the floor to you both. I think it's going to be a joint interwoven presentation, seamless. So I will hand it over to the first person here. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mike. And I will share my screen in a second. So do you see my screen?
Yep. We've got it.
All right. All right. First of all, thanks, Professor Mike Robinson, and thanks everybody for listening to us today. You have heard me a lot already in the conference, so I don't think, Mike, anybody needs to hear more about me. But thanks for introducing us. This paper is co-authored by Dr. Andrew Knight and myself, and we are both. I am an architect, and Andrew is a philosopher, or a researcher in philosophy. And what, as our research and collaboration together, is just trying to look on the embedded challenges and philosophical understanding of the notion of virtual heritage, and how this notion is taking us into new territories that perhaps we need a little bit deeper understanding of this phenomena and how its impact on human interaction and relationships and the connection between human objects. So we have been studying this work for some time, and we hope to share with you some of the development of that study. So the paper title is Revisiting Kant's Moral Theory on Human Object Relationship in the Context of Virtual Heritage Environments. So I will start the first part by introducing our work on the heritage and the virtual heritage and what we hope to achieve from that. Then Andrew will take over with discussions, a deep discussion of Kant's. I keep reading about it and I'm trying to understand it, but it will never be as a philosopher talking and discussing it in details. Then we'll go back to some of our applications and discussion afterwards. So the first part here is just about really touching on our perception and the notion of preservation of cultural heritage. And here our built heritage is actually, it's centered about our understanding of our connection with the environment we live in. It is not only the built fabric, as this image from medieval Cairo will tell you, it's about really connection between one historic monuments into another and one from religious indicator to another, but it's about what is history behind them. It is actually about how those different elements of the built environment, monumental or domestic or even smaller buildings, connect to our personal histories and narratives through which we can understand the cultural values of our day. Effectively, when we are looking at heritage, we are looking at a long process of education, a process of evolution through which cultural heritage or built heritage in that sense is just actually intrinsically attached to the process of building and layering. And this process of building itself, it's not only a professional practice or artifacts, but it's a much more inclusive social and cultural change. In that sense, that we look at the heritage as an environment, as an inclusive, intimate relationship between the human, the people within a space at a certain point in time. And there's a certain point in time, it's actually to continue to evolve. And through every day that we live within a space, we actually trying to accumulate and contribute to that heritage and its evolution. So by preserving something that is left from previous generations, it's actually, we had to go through a process of learning through that heritage and try to engage with it and try to build and add to it. So every piece that we build as architects is actually adding a smaller piece of the puzzle or a piece of layer that could be a heritage in 50 or 100 years time. So there's a kind of a process of handing over such kind of different elements, but it's not only living in isolation, it's not artifacts and objects that living in isolation, but actually they are testament and evidence on a much deeper cultural and social phenomena. When it comes to such kind of understanding of the connection between people and places, then we would understand that the sudden and forced change of such kind of heritage, destructions through wars and conflicts or due to ideological differences, as we have seen in Bosnia, when the Serbs were trying to really eliminate any evidence of the existence of Muslim artifacts. Then you understand that actually the elimination is not about building, but it's about really the whole socio-cultural system and acknowledgement of the memories of that society in this particular place. And hence any change in that heritage becomes a process of cultural appropriation of people. It's not only about even erasing history, but it's about actually influencing the culture of today and the agenda for the future. So by altering heritage, actually you can really eliminate layers of that understanding of today's life. Then comes to that historic context. And here we are looking at some of the process of everyday life in that historic city of Cairo. Then when you are looking at walking into the middle of a historic places as a tourist, you will look at it as a kind of a series of artifacts and touristic objects. But for the local, it's about economy. It's about how we can earn money, how we can really engage with the built environment, what kind of that built environment and that urban space actually is giving me in return, how it facilitates my life. But also it's the container within which as humans we engage with each other. So there's a responsibility to us, to each other, to really preserve this as a collective community place and as a kind of enclave in which we live and grow, but also it is really has connection to the livelihood of different groups. And this will take us to the next point about really preserving that process. So it's if we move from being artifact and objects to becoming a process, so how we can really become, we need to focus on that process. And the process here links to the tradition. So by the act of destruction, as we have seen in ISIS destruction of Mosul, for example, as you can see from the pictures on top left, which was hung by local communities around the library, Mosul library when it was destroyed, is actually there is a lot of things about that memories. So this is actually the pictures that everybody understand and engraved in the local population. So by trying to destroy such kind of connection between the visual and the space by eliminating certain buildings, so you're actually trying to impact and influence individuals' memory. Be eliminating the space, so actually you're impacting the spatial memories that conjures that kind of dense web images by eliminating them. So, and by eliminating the images and the buildings, you indirectly impacting events. And here becomes an interesting relationship between memory and material objects. Does the material object in themselves have that memory embedded in them? So if you get an object and you take it, as many communities really travel across borders and so on, they carry that object, but does it have the memory, or just memory of the events that associated with that moment in time? Here becomes a very critical relationship between the space, the story, and the narrative that really comes with it. So that's kind of cognitive relationship and understanding of the connection between heritage as socio-cultural and has historical meanings, but also the space that has physical characteristics. And hence, by the act of preserving a space or preserving a historic city or a building that lasted regardless 50 or 60 or 70 years, there's a kind of a responsibility about really taking that heritage and keeping it. So actually the process of learning continues and try to hand it over to a new generation. Of course, this doesn't mean that everything needs to be preserved, or otherwise we will not be moving or changing. And here becomes that sometimes the obsession with heritage, and here will be the counter argument, that heritage here sometimes that we value it so much that we need to preserve everything, and which, while this is not possible by any means, and this sometimes undermines the change that happens. So we look at some, as you can see here on the left-hand side, the two patterns of historic Cairo, part of it medieval, and the other part is European, classical European of the 19th century. One has a dense web of maze-like streets and has a certain lifestyle that grew up with it, but the others just have an entirely different layer of history. So sometimes appreciation of heritage doesn't mean that we have to be really obsessed with it and its loss becomes a catastrophe. But actually, even appreciating the heritage becomes a kind of sometimes a counterproductive in the way that it has become a problem in itself. And here it becomes really looking at the relationship between the tradition and change. Tradition is a kind of a practice that is really developed and learned as become an educational process embedded in communities, but also it embeds change. And that change is actually allows it to be resilient, to be more adaptable, but also more evolutionary. And this becomes the value of that heritage, not in the building, but actually in the intangible, in the community of the people that really connect with it, learn from it. If you don't have people, you don't have the community, then buildings and heritage physical as physical objects or even buildings outside becomes meaningless. And here becomes this kind of interesting relationship and mutual relationship between building there to actually capture the history, but transfer it back also as a knowledge to humans. And this becomes problematic, and this is what we are problematizing it in a way in the virtual heritage domain. So if this is really direct physical connection, how this will happen in the virtual domain? Here, interesting thing about virtual heritage is about reconstructing that heritage in an entirely imaginary way. So the physicality here has become challenged. But in order to really reproduce it in an imaginary domain, in a virtual environment, you need to look at the three-dimensional. It is not only really capturing images as two-dimensional representation, but also not actually about even connecting it in a three-dimensional physical statics. If in order to have a virtual heritage, all our understanding and perception of that heritage becomes really still transferring the connection between the space, the buildings, and people and time into that environment. Here, in that sense, recreating cultural heritage environments has to be populated, has to be really engaged with the material culture, with the object, with the stories behind it, in a way to try to translate and to keep a picture or a record of that historic period in time. And here I'll take you to some of the practices that we have done. Perhaps some of you have seen some of that work yesterday in our exhibition. And one of the questions we ask ourselves, if we are, this is the Nottingham Castle, and this is the laser scanning that we have done it for it. The castle now has moved between one period to another. So it has been redeveloped while the external skin remain more or less the same, but the internal arrangements, spaces, and even the object and the statues that are presented here on the top right corner has been removed. And the galleries have a different character, and the courtyard on the top left here has been covered and entirely redesigned. So one of the things that why you are doing this, if this will change, and this is not, I'm not talking about 5 centuries history, I'm talking about 3 years ago, but as this a historic asset in the city, so we record it at a moment in time while we know that this will be change coming on. So there is a responsibility on us to really record that particular moment in time as a kind of a diary of that building, a diary of space, similar to you reveal the conscious relationship to your history through writing your diaries or recording pictures or having such kind of narratives to your personal stories. Buildings could have the similar layer by recognition of that this moment in time won't happen again. So actually 5 years from now, there will be a different version, 10 years from now will be a different version. So actually capturing this and having this record in the virtual domain really allow us to really have such kind of a fine lines between what exists as a static heritage, but actually more to do with the dynamism and the change and recognition of change as a something part of that tradition and progress. So we come to the point, what value to society does preserving and understanding tradition have? Do we really need to do that? Do we need to keep recording every building, every moment in time? Because this is what a virtual environment can develop. And as we discussed earlier today or heard from Michael Scott, actually laser scanning can give you abilities, and actually recording that into virtual format can give you entirely different perspectives. But also what's critical point here, it changes your relationship as a human with the building, because the direct connections now is becoming no longer about the physicality and the physical touch, and whatever you do to the building could destroy it, but actually you are operating and engaging with it in the virtual domain. At this point, I will hand it over to Andrew. Andrew?
Yeah, so what I was looking at really following conversations with Gamal is there any way in which we can base a moral sort of a moral reason to preserve heritage? Because obviously there is law to preserve heritage, but that's quite weak and tends to change over space and time. So I was looking for something a bit more universal. And with that in mind, that's where the is ought is appropriate. The law is a certain way, but what ought to be the case? And therefore, to protect the interests, I think, of past generations, the current generations and future generations, we need to look at a moral framework. My view was that, talking through with Gamal, that probably Kant's work would be the most useful here, since he was somebody, an Enlightenment thinker that really was at the crossroads in the 18th century. And what he managed to do is synthesize the work that had been undertaken by the rationalists on one hand, and on the other side, the empiricists. So you've got the likes of Hume on the empiricist side, who was operating in Scotland, and then Leibniz and Spinoza and those sorts of people on the continent. And Kant was a revolution, really, in terms of thinking about things, because he brought, in terms of ethics, I think, he brought a formalism and a logic to our intuitions, our moral intuitions. Now, why I put it's neo-Kantian is Kant particularly focused on persons, and you could argue by extending his morality to things like heritage, you're doing something Kant didn't actually do, which is give moral status to objects. But my argument would be, well, they are the products of humanity. There are other alternative ways you could have gone with this. One's virtue ethics, and the other is utilitarianism. And I just think the Kantian works better because it's based on reason, and it's what's known as a priori. You sort it out before you actually get to the problem, rather than try and calculate positives and negatives. Okay, next page. Thank you. There we go. So this is going to have to be very quick, because I know we're at 16 minutes, but the supreme principle of morality is what he called the categorical imperative. And a categorical imperative is something you must do, whereas a hypothetical one is one where you do X if you want Y. If you want food, you go to Tesco, whereas the categorical imperative is you must do something. So this is there are various formulations of the categorical imperative. Probably the most famous one, oh, never to act except for in such a way that I can also will my maxim become a universal law. What that basically means is really act in a way you want other people to act. Slightly more formal than that. So would I rationally want a world where every time I saw something, I would steal it? No, I wouldn't. It would be irrational for me to do that or for people to lie. Therefore, it's about not making an exception of yourself. So as a generation of people, would I want, if I lived in 200 years' time, would I want a world in which previous generations had neglected the heritage of humanity and let it go into decay and had not tried to preserve it in any way or shape? And it'd be irrational for me to want that, I think, if I was in a future generation. And therefore, I shouldn't do that now. I have a moral obligation to preserve it in a way that I want previous generations to preserve it and future. So, and it's not just about destruction as well, in that sense of blowing things up or letting them decay. So Gamal's work in the labyrinth shows the damage water can do. It's also about how we treat heritage in things like gaming. Submersive technologies a great pedagogic tool, but I would argue from a Kantian perspective to treat humanity as an end in itself, which is the next formulation of the categorical imperative. I shouldn't just treat heritage as an entertainment to be used in a game. It should, we should have values of truth and take account of pedagogy, i.e. the art and science of learning, so that when people play games, they're being exposed to rigorous history rather than just a bricolage of things that look nice. So there are various formulations of the categorical imperative, and I think most of them will cash out that we need to take heritage seriously. There's a distinction. The other thing Kant always talks about is duty. We must do things from duty. And so a good illustration for it might be you have a duty to preserve a ruin, but you can get some money from the lottery or the heritage fund to do it. Now, if your real reason is to get the cash, even though it's in accordance with duty, so you're still preserving it, Kant would say that's not a moral action because it's not acting from duty. You're acting in accordance with duty, which is a subtle difference. Next slide. So, very briefly then, it's neo-Kantian because it focuses on objects rather than people. But I think Kantian universalism, the idea we can create rules which are based on a rational will, are a good way of framing our responsibility to precarious historic sites. And I think this is important because if there's a fragmented legal system and there's no profit motive in doing these sorts of things, you need something that's quite clear as a theoretical framework in which to base codes of conduct and those sorts of things. And I think if you do this, you are respecting persons, but previous persons, people that did exist and no longer do. They produce products of humanity, I would argue. So treating humanity as an end in itself. I think the Hawara illustrations of the labyrinth are a good illustration there. Respect for current persons, which is the gaming and the pedagogy. We must treat people as ends in themselves, not means to ends, and I'm saying the product of humanity. So the way we use things in gaming, we have a duty to do it as accurately as possible. And finally, future persons, they don't exist yet. So there are all sorts of ontological questions about future people, whether you owe anything to them. But I would say, yes, you do. And you can test that out with a categorical imperative by putting yourself in that way, in the place of the future persons. So I don't know if we need to say anything else, Gamal, to finish off. We're over time. We're at 21 minutes. But that's the philosophical ethical argument for preserving heritage.
Mike, can we continue for a couple of minutes? You are on mute. You are on mute. Mike, you are on mute. I can't hear you.
I think he's saying 2 minutes.
Yeah, I will give you
Alright.
two. I will give you 2 minutes. I'll give everybody else the same time over. Okay.
Yes.
2
Alright.
minutes.
Sorry, because just it's actually coming back to what Andrew is making, because just I'm illustrating it for the next few slides. It's about really creating a new environment, which is actually trying to get historic traces and rebuild the entirely imaginary virtual environment to host and accommodate such kind of principles. And this becomes a kind of a recreation of that history as a matter of duty. And this is as a kind of an example in Scotland, when there's some kind of historic Edinburgh or the Shetland has been created as a part of envisioning the past. But going to Hawara, which is something that Andrew mentioned, because it's about really saving that particular historic monument, but actually it does not include all of its collections, artifacts in one place. They are spread across the globe. And the only way as a duty for us to bring that history back to this particular place, so it becomes a joint share or a shared environment for education and learning, at the same time as a kind of moral duty to bring that historic fact, that historic artifact that has been widespread across the globe, just to do that through virtual environment. And through this, you can start really using such kind of an environment, not only for gaming, not only for really impacting, getting people to demolish or destroy or to play a gaming that impact your relationship with that particular historic site, but actually trying to really bring the facts, bring the history together in a way that does not exist before. And this is the labyrinth that Andrew mentioned in his talk, is about actually some of historic traces in the past. That's the only way that we try to really bring it to the virtual, to reality, is a virtual environment, because it no longer exists. And here is where our duty perhaps really informs the way that we are using technology and how it becomes a useful source for us. So in conclusion, it's just this kind of digital technology has the potential of actually contributing indirectly to saving endangered and vulnerable heritage sites, but there are moral imperatives that does not really, imperatives that do not detract from the character and the code that give us theoretical force. And just to conclude quickly, there is such kind of technology sometimes that really manipulate certain processes and moral laws and that exist between governments or institutions. And that's why we need to really develop a kind of a more forms of ethical and moral and legal approach to it. Thanks, Mike, and sorry for taking a bit longer.
No, thank you very much to both of you. And we'll hold our questions till the end. But if we can move on to our next presenter, to Yifei Li, and Yifei, I will give you the same amount of time, so you have about 25 minutes. Okay, again, we'll be a little bit flexible about that. Yifei Li is a lecturer at the Department of Art in Shenzhen University, and she's been honoured with being a top 10 outstanding youth for National Award in Design Industry, and she's been involved with innovative design methods, particularly in the areas of film and architecture, interdisciplinary design and social architecture. And her most recent publication was Interactive Architecture, Interdisciplinary Design, Pedagogy. So without further ado, please, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for your introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Can everybody see it?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for everyone being present. And today I'm going to present my research. And I think this might be an interesting story for you. So the title is The Regeneration of the Urban Village from the Cultural Production Perspective, and the case of Nantou Old Town in Shenzhen. So the urban village is one of the most vibrant urban forms in contemporary Chinese cities. So this paper draws on the cultural production theory to understand the evolving social spatial traditions in urban villages by reviewing a culture event. Since 1989, the urban villages have transformed from the rural settlement to hybrid communities that provides affordable housing for the migrant population in Shenzhen. However, it has been stigmatized for a long time that the debate on urban village need to be explored to consider the cultural diversity and creativity as a crucial asset for urban regeneration. And since 1970s, the cultural turn has played a central role in urban planning throughout Europe and the USA, followed by a place marketing. And Shenzhen in China did earn the hallmark of creative city of design in place marketing by its achievements in culture and creative industries. And the creative city, as well as world city, aims at capturing the popular imagination with local politicians, officials, and business and media elites worldwide to grasp the idea. And during the process, the elite culture contribute most to urban economies by attracting global investment and tourists, as well as stimulating the process of gentrification. When all the cities pursue the same modern creative image, it just results in the loss of authenticity. So in consequence, the diversity of culture and social life are being assimilated by the homogeneous ethos and triggering the trend of building flagship projects as well as class differentiation. Thus, the paper tries to inquiry about the nature of culture in the planning policy, or specifically the motivation of local culture in driving sustainable urban regeneration and economic growth. So the renovation of urban village in Nantou Old Town has provided a new model of urban regeneration and local culture revitalization in China. And at the same time, the paper draws on the study of cultural production and field theory from French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu to analyze the diverse cultural preferences and practices among different fields, different groups, and different social classes. So in Bourdieu's point of view, field is a structured space of positions in which the positions and their interrelations are determined by the distribution of different kinds of resources, or namely capital. So the basic idea is that we cannot understand cultural forms without the context in which they are produced and consumed. That argument basically just makes the theoretical underpinning for my research for this paper. And although urban village is a arrival settlement for the migrant population, especially for the low-income peasant workers, but different from the slums, urban enclaves, or squatters in the global context, the urban village in Shenzhen is a vibrant socio-economic community, and it provides housing, not only housing, but also commercials and schools, police stations and factories. So as you can see, it is basically an ecosystem. And according to the investigation reports, it shows that in the migrant city Shenzhen, almost 16 million of the residents live in rental housing, wherein 11 million of them live in urban village. And the tenants constitute a significant proportion of the burgeoning new middle class in China. And now the people living in urban villages shows a tendency of multi-classes and multicultural background rather than the initial low-income peasant workers. And regardless of developing endeavors to preserve these communities, the urban villages have long been stigmatized in the dominant culture because of the poor image it has, like the dirty streets, the crowded living space, disrepair facilities. But the fact is that the urban village serves as a eclectic housing solution for migrant population because owing to the limitation of household registration system, which is very unique in China, it's called hukou in Chinese, and it's distinguished the rural and urban population institutionally. And hukou is the fundamental barrier deciding the rights of housing ownership and the public services in the city. So therefore, the nomadic lifestyle seems to be the inevitable choice for the migrant population at the moment, whereas the urban villages as housing providers also make the social structure problem specialized. And the social space emerging from urban village not only manifests the changing spatial production relations, but also the social production relations between the local villagers and the migrants who are landlords and tenants, as well as their cultural identities. The fact is that the social hierarchies as well as the cultural taste is not constant, but socially and historically constructed, which provides sources for creativity and innovation. And as Bourdieu argues that individuals may be more or less characterized by one's place of permanent residence, and since social and spatial segregation is the persistent fact within the complex history of uneven geographical development, it is an inevitable and long process for both local villagers and migrants to resettle in the city, to reconstructing their social hierarchies and realizing their cultural integration. And for the migrant population and rural turned class, the cultural reproduction or the education is still a potential approach for reclaiming the status in the city. Well, in the world, the urban village phenomena has transcended the manifestation of urban-rural spatial transition, and it is a process of cultural reconstruction by the migrant population along with their social mobility. So this kind of fills in the gap of culture examining the related research of urban village in China. So in 2017, there is a biennial called Shenzhen and Hong Kong Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture, which is the UABB in short. It develops the idea of urban curation that inhabits Nantou Old Town as the exhibition venue. And the theme of a biennials, the city's growing difference, can be interpreted as an experimental opportunity to balance the urban regeneration and historical preservation in Nantou Old Town. So you can just look at the mapping here. It's a mapping, it's a diagram of the cultural event, UABB. And the blue circle, one of the blue circle is Nantou Old Town, which represents the biennial in 2070s. And the other two blue circle is urban public space. And the red dot means industrial heritage site. So that will be another topic. So this paper just researched the Nantou Old Town as the exhibition venue of the cultural event. And in this event, the visitors were fully encouraged to reimagine the future vision of urban villages and explore the potential planning for a better living environment. And meanwhile, the local residents have also been guided by the professional to conduct spontaneous bottom-up activity through a variety of public participation. including gourmet tasting, pop-up market, reading day, free lottery, and extra. And in other words, the Biennial strongly encouraged the residents' participation in the space and content of exhibitions. So the cultural event has stimulated an extensive discussion on urban village among different classes and professionals through public participation and online interaction, especially through some media platforms. So thereby the professionals started to collaborate and co-produce with the local residents as cultural intermediaries to shape and disseminate the subcultures, which finally influenced the policy making. The policy was kind of, it's claimed the necessity of urban village. The policy recognized the urban village as an essential carrier of intangible cultural heritage, and also it meets the housing demand and helps maintain the balance between employment and housing. So the change on the policy making indicates that the understanding of the urban village phenomenon has undergone a significant change through decades. But however, the nature of cultural value remains unexplained and unexplored in the policy, or namely, of which social groups does the culture represent? They didn't answer that question in the policy. So the accommodated lower middle and working class have their own forms of culture to reinforce their status and identities in the cities. And the cultural value manifests not only the tangible and intangible rural heritage and middle-class culture, but also the ever-fusing and changing new cultures produced by the newcomers. In brief, the cultural value in the planning policy is supposed to transcend the provincial meaning of local culture, which is usually refers to folk culture or other archaic forms. And to migrant city like Shenzhen, the urban authenticity to which they pursue will not be inborn or inherited. It is achieved through endeavors of mutually constructing the origins and new beginnings of the city. To some extent, the Biennial succeeded in bringing increasing visitors as well as public participation, as well as attention, and also resonated with intellectuals and professionals. However, there are barely interaction between some of the artworks and the residents. For example, some public art installation by overseas artists interact with neither the residents nor the visitors, because most of the public art installation represent the artist's abstract ideas, whereas the audience with different background perceives the artworks differently, which closely related to their cultural backgrounds, classes, and taste. So in Bourdieu's view, the artwork exists not only as a material production, but also as a symbolic object that recognizes and distinguish its audience by class, habitus, and cultural capital. In other words, the artwork is understood as a manifestation of the field as a whole, in which all the powers of the field and all the determinants inherent in its structure and functioning are concentrated. However, the audience of the analog's quasi-folklore culture could neither understand their living environment in globalization through exhibition form, nor favor the pure artistic products from the artistic field, since both of the subfield attract their audience by specific interests. And more importantly, the artistic production is in fact an autonomous process of producing and consuming their own products within each subfield. So as mentioned, people can neither understand the cultural form without its context, nor consume any cultural product without symbolic meanings. But in contemporary society, the cultural preferences manifest a free setup between different classes and cultural field, which is mainly distinguished by the similar lifestyles and tastes rather than the fixed social classes. So in a peripheral urban neighborhoods, different agents seek to create power of discourse, explanations, ideology, and cultural value to grasp the dominant power in the field and establish their social presence in the city. So cultural preferences in a peripheral urban neighborhood can contribute to foster a sense of place and community belonging and the local collective action. However, from a global view, more localized symbols are appropriated by global culture industry. As you may observe, the vulgar image of Hong Kong slums as a popular inspiration for Hollywood movies. So in that case, it comes to the final conclusion that I might argue that the cultural value in the domestic planning policy ought to transcend the provincial meaning of local culture and produce its uniqueness in the national and international cultural arena. And the second point is that the UABB, the Biennial Cultural Event, actually creates a new model for urban regeneration strategy in China, and it reversed the stigmatized image of the urban village and presented a thriving business of the authentic everyday scenario to the public. So now we know that the urban village is an integral part of China's urbanization, and it plays a positive, essential role in bringing transferable new human resources and the informal economic practice. So therefore, there are some suggestions are coming up to facilitate this sustainable strategy, which can be concludes for the first place, preserving the authenticity of history and culture of the urban villages. Second, integrating the informal socio-economic activities happened in urban village. Third, improving urban infrastructure and public services to improve the image, the stigmatized image of urban village. And last but not least, building organic organization and vibrant communities by empowering the urban inhabitants and embracing diverse social culture changes. So that is the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Ife. That was wonderfully timed. You had a little bit more time, but you didn't need it. You said everything you needed to say. Thank you so much. Okay, we move on to our final presentation of this session by Esin Ekizoglu, and Esin is an architect, an urban designer, and also PhD candidate in urban planning and design at EVCAO Laboratory in Paris, Val de Seine School of Architecture. And her work questions the interconnecting spaces through territories described both by personal, private mobile data and their impact on architecture and urban practices. She's the co-editor of the journal Enciclio, and she's also a delegate of the PhD Students of the Identities, Cultures and Territoire Research Laboratory in Paris Diderot. So it's your turn, Esin.
Thank you for your presentation, Mike. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. If you just,
perhaps
that's it. That's wonderful.
Like that?
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I will talk about a part of my research or PhD today. It's a simple experience, and I titled this representation "A New Tradition in the Era of Mobility Systems: Mobile Digital Traces." My structure of the presentation, I will introduce a little bit my ideas, and I will talk about the state of art, the questionings and the methodology of the little experience that I will explain, the results, and I will finish with a little discussion and conclusion. And my research on urban planning and development has a dynamism and enlightens in the development of the modes of transports and their diffusion. As far as the developing technical objects like Gilbert Simondon is thinking, allow us to be aware of each urban development easily. Our physical distances are becoming shorter at a global scale, and each subject equipped with an individual technical object manages his or her own information bubble with interacting with this object. This object can be a smartphone, a portable, and it can be all the little objects like that. And for the state of art, I can say that nowadays the inventions resulting from the pictorial and operative images of the cities are already in the human context. There are few research studies taking care of the qualities of the urban and architectural transporting growth area. They don't evaluate the culture, habits, behavior of the citizens. And the previous research focuses on ephemeral habits of the occupants of the cities and cross them with their stable data. And today my experiences questions how does the technical object serve the city dwellers to produce the mobile digital traces, and how a completely assisted city produce images via mobile technical objects. And that's why I will talk about the study in which we hypothesized that the traces of physical bodies recorded and shared using technical objects could lead us to the development of the mobile territories. That's why we had a cartographic approach, and we examined the physical movements of the inhabitants of Strasbourg city, recorded digitally via individualized technical objects. And our study was performed into 2 phases. During the first phase, we compared the visual and perceptible characteristics of the geolocalized data of the city of Strasbourg. During this phase, we obtained the data via the contributors of OpenStreetMap website. The data was freely shared, the circulation of the technical individualized objects from 2007 to 2019. And in this picture, you can see the cartography of the city of Strasbourg. The red lines represent the networks of train and tramway. The green lines are cycling paths, and the blue lines represent Rhine River. And in this area, it's 84 square kilometers, and we studied 88 journeys, and we excluded 13 journeys because they belong to the 9 subjects who already shared several journeys, and 35 journeys because they did not cover the entire working year, and they did not show a logic of crossing the river of the Rhine River. And therefore, our findings are obtained using the data of remaining 26 journeys, each belong to different subjects. And yes, and in this part, you can see the reading of the mobile territories of existing soft urban traces, water networks, cyclist networks, and we superimposed the mobile territories of the OpenStreetMap on these layers. And when we study in detail, we can see that there were 4 movement strategies which attract our attention. The first was a simple journey moving from the starting to finishing point. And the second strategy was essentially based on the presence of the Rhine River, as traveling in the east-west direction was difficult. Going along the Rhine River allowed the inhabitants of the Strasbourg to find a suitable place to move in this direction, in the direction east and west. The bridge and the recreational landscapes played an important role in this type of strategy because there was a need to cross the Rhine River. And the last strategy was a combination of the second and the third strategy. The contributors of OSM benefited of both the organization of the rivers and landscape, leaning the 2 sides of the Rhine River to move easily in the east-west direction. In this card of the result at the left side, you can see the historical concern of the tram evolution of the city of Strasbourg from 2007 to 2019. At the right side, you can see the mobile traces of the OSM contributors. While studying this part, its part is we can see that when the mobile traces were superimposed on the evolution of the Strasbourg tram network, we realized that the contributors moved using the soft networks of the city instead of using the tram network on the east-west direction. They used cycle lanes, pedestrian landscapes, or also a very little bus network. Furthermore, our results showed that the Rhine River and its landscape were almost impermeable, and there are, even if there are transport facilities by both, but they seem to serve exclusively tourists. I will show a simple sample of examples of 4 detailed journeys. The 1 and 2 represent 2 journeys with water crossing, and the third and the fourth one represent 2 journeys running along the Rhine River several times, having 7 years apart. When we look at the first and the second journey, we can see that there is 2 ways of crossing the Rhine River at 2 different times. These journeys were rather fluid. OSM contributors were not comfortable in their movement. Both used the same plots while moving on journeys having 7 years apart. And during the period between these 2 times, the city was investing its tram networks. And the last journeys, third and fourth one, they showed us that the way to enjoy the landscape around the Rhine River remained quite similar despite the development of the public transport in the north-south axis. Contributors were disposed to take the east-west direction. And I will talk about a little bit of my discussion of the paper. While studying the results at a large scale in a qualitative way and with a historical concern of the tram's evolution, it seems that there have been a few changes in the strategies of displacement of the inhabitants between 2007 and 2019. These strategies were often the same despite the development of the tram network of the city. We wondered to know if the tram network developed because between these two dates met all of the expectations of the inhabitants of the Strasbourg, which remained unanswered. And our findings favored that the urban practices developed in parallel with the individual habits. The individual technical objects acted as a mediation and physical and imaginary communication tool. And it seems us that the land use conflicts can be resolved by focusing on mobile territories because we think that the cities will be able to absorb the areas of unused space pointed by these territories. And to conclude, in the 21st century, digital technologies, social media, and mobile devices add a new interactive dimension to cultural experiences and tradition. A new fight of possibilities has opened up through the use of the individual mobile technologies and objects, and the new use has diverted new functions of this work of these objects by making them everyday tools for citizens, and they would have certainly an impact on the work of the designers when they are used in a collaborative and open access manner. Thereafter, they may lead us to further design of new actions in coherence with the nature of the human beings. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much again. Nobody need worry about time in this session. Everybody's kept to time despite having a little bit more. But thank you very much to all three presenters for really interesting presentations. Before I open it up to questions, and I have quite a few questions, but I was just thinking about the theme that we've been trying to address in this session, which is about the impacts of the digital age, and I just wanted to sort of I don't know, generate two sort of fundamental questions, which might sort of you might in your either in a general sense or in a specific sense want to sort of pick up on at any point in time. The first one is, and it's an assumption, I think, is, are we really in the digital age? And I guess the next sort of corollary to that is, well, who is in the digital age, and more importantly, who is not within the digital age? So that was something that was just sort of running through my mind when I was sort of listening to you all, in a sense, in slightly different ways. And then I guess the other thing, which it is a further reflection on terms of how each presentation is seeing the virtual and the digital, and I guess the question is, to what extent does the digital generate dissonance and rupture in whether you're talking about within an urban village setting, or you're talking about it in Old Cairo, or does it just amplify dissonance and rupture? So I mean, it's the sort of, I guess it's the agency of the digital which may be something to reflect on. As I say, I have many other specific questions, but I will first throw it open to everybody who have specific questions for each of our presenters. So if you'd like to use your raise your hand, your virtual hand or your physical hand, whatever you want to do.
I think just
Yes, please.
I can do the virtual and the physical.
Yeah, go on.
Thanks, Mike. I think you are right. I think it's actually listening to the final presentation by Esin. It really tells you a lot about how we are being digitally traced everywhere you go. And I think it's just, as you mentioned, this intriguing question about who is living the digital. I think it's already, the rapture is already happening. And our data is being harvested as we speak now. All this translate into codes and processes and information somewhere and being generated by maps, which is a question that I wish to ask Esin afterwards. How this data is being traded, how a researcher can get such kind of wealth of information and the big data and all of these things. But in general, I think the rapture was already happening. I think, as you rightly said, that it is already, it's being amplified, I think, because the digital has been already happening for some time. The data was already hidden somewhere. But suddenly, with the big data and with the perception of this data, it has a value for research, for study, for even commercial value. Similar to what we have seen with the vaccine and track and trace. Effectively, we are being looked at as some of those technical objects in a way that isn't talked about it. We are effectively a digital beings more than a physical beings anymore, unless you go and isolate yourself from everything that connects you to a data somewhere. And I think then itself that you create this kind of two characters, you and your clone, digital clone that we see sometimes in some ads. So really, this is a reality. It is not just really, it's the duality of our existence at the moment, which really generates lots of discussion, but I don't want to extend on that. So I think it's a very important point, Mike, and I totally agree.
Would Esin or Ife, do you want to comment on that? Ife?
Yeah. As you just asked about the question about who benefits from the age of digital, so I want to explain a little bit more about my PhD research. I forgot to mention that I'm also a PhD student in Liverpool. So my PhD research was kind of about the taste and class formation in China. But as you can see, the Pierre Bourdieu studies was conducted in last centuries, researching the situation in French society in 19th centuries. The situation is quite different from the contemporary China. And in that society, there is no internet, no any kind of digital applications. But now we are living in 21st centuries, and we are connected by every digital applications. And as I've mentioned a little bit in the presentation, that the culture was said by Bourdieu. Culture was educated, inherited, acquired by their social origins or habitus or social trajectories. But this situation seems, or say this theory is not very applicable for contemporary China, because everyone lives in an information society that she or he could learn everything from the internet, from every platform which is virtual through the internet. So can we identify individuals' social background, social origin from his educational level or his aesthetic disposition? My answer is no. For the moment, we cannot identify a person's aesthetic disposition from his origin. This is not corresponding in today's society. So that's kind of my opinions in response to this question, but I'm still researching that. Yes.
Okay.
I will leave it to Andrew.
Andrew?
I'll just pick up what you've been saying there actually about Bourdieu and this issue of agency. I think if we think of agency as related to freedom as human beings, I think we've got far more fluidity around our agency because of technology. And as you were saying there, we can learn more from the internet. So we can't be so easily categorized as being from this background with these tastes. So there's more fluidity. But I don't think that necessarily means we've got more agency. It's a different form of agency, because I think digital technologies have submerged us in a world in which we're far more controlled. We see this in elections and things, where instead of getting the mainstream news, we're driven by clickbait and all sorts of algorithms to different world views than we would naturally. So I think we've lost a lot of agency through the use of technologies in our lives. And if you see a lot of young people now, they'll have the TV on, but they're constantly scrolling their phone. It's almost addictive around the things they think they're interested in, they're being pushed into. So I would say it's harder to categorize groups of people based on tastes and preferences related to social class, which we used to do. But that isn't because we've got more agency, it's because we've become more fragmented, and we've also in some ways lost agency, and we've probably become more towards a model of deterministic. They can almost predict what you're going to do in a way they couldn't before. That sounds slightly contradictory, but I think I'm making a bit of sense there.
Sure. Esin, have you got a perspective on this?
I was thinking about what Wifi said about Bourdieu. I guess if we think about Simondon, we can see that technical objects are already in our everyday living, and I guess I'm thinking like Wi-Fi, but it's not very I cannot develop really further.
Okay. We have a question from Stuart Birch. Are you there, Stuart?
Yep. Hello.
Hi. Do you want to ask your questions?
I can. I had two questions. My first one was, we can read things that were written down hundreds of years ago, centuries ago, and we can look and appreciate statues that were carved thousands of years ago. And yet I have a floppy disk in the attic that I can't access the digital data from it. So my question is, how do you guys, with your digital products that you're making and using, do you think about future-proofing them? Does it matter? Esin, you talked about digital traces, but we leave all these digital traces, and will all these formats be readable in the future? I doubt it very much. So how do you have a view about that in terms of, it looks like we're preserving everything and we're mapping and producing all this stuff, but people in the future, they might not be able to read any of the stuff, and all the traces that used to be written are now in disappearing messages on apps. So the people in the future might know less about us today than we know about people thousands of years ago. So it's about future-proofing technology. Is that something you think about?
The data that I used was open access by the contributors of the OSM OpenStreetMap Foundation. And that if, for example, I tried to go through this to search, study other traces, but all the big part of these traces are private, has a private status in these days. They are not open. We are producing the data, but it's not open, and there is something political in this view. Perhaps if we have the researchers are allowed to access to this information, perhaps we can make some efforts to some information, valuable information for the populations, perhaps. But in this time, they are a big part of this data are private, and for they are they cost some things, and we cannot study and we cannot create some information for the society, like you say in the books or written things, written.
Okay. Yeah. So that raises, your answer raises lots of questions about what's inaccessible today, but maybe I didn't express myself. My computer is full of files, and they're .docx and .pdf and .whatever, MP3s. You guys are using stuff and producing video and things, but will those formats be accessible in the future? How do you make sure that the things that you're producing will be readable in the future?
Come in, Mike.
Please, please.
Yes, it's a very intriguing question, Stuart, and thanks for asking that, because I think every time that we speak about the virtual heritage, I think this fundamental question comes across. It's just with data, it's big data. So it's actually multiplied millions of times. It's too much data to carve. As similarly as you highlighted perfectly, that we know much about previous civilizations because the traces are physical, statued in certain places. But what we are having now is too much for so millions of people. But one thing I have to highlight, and this is for the debating point of view, argumentative point of view. What we learned about previous civilizations is just only very tiny bit about their lives. It's only the physical object, but we don't know much about their lives, who were there, what was happening. So still the underlying element about such kind of heritage or culture is knowledge, and the knowledge means data. And the data that we are getting from the past is quite limited because still we are attached only to physical objects and their characteristics, and we analyze them through archaeology and lots of things. What is happening now, it's a different generation of data, but it is there, and yes, you can preserve it and you can collect it and you can analyze it. And I will give you a simple thing. Everything that we are doing as a human being just is being recorded, attached to your name. And actually this is easily can be traceable and you can single it out. And I'll give you an example. The face map, just when you open your phone with your biometrics, and this is your name, your phone, every call, everything that you have done. So if somebody would like to bring you out of 1 million people, he will do, or she will do. And this tells you that it's so much information about you. I think your point about really perhaps too much data to preserve and to keep and to know about us, I think the technology takes us in a place where it's not you will need to know about society, it's just about the individual. because it's just too much data about that individual and that individual and that individual. So I think it's a whole kind of, when the data shifts to become so detailed and so traceable and so individualistic, I think it becomes a new types of, let's say, preservation, data collection, and analytics, and that's why they are calling it. But in terms of preservation, I think the systems and technology is evolutionary anyway. I think our worries in technology is not being preserved or remain or future proof. I think it might be too much to really of a power to technology to know about you much more than what you know yourself. And it's just tracing everything around you that you know that you don't know that's already on record. And I think that's the initial point that I made about you have a digital clone that has every information about you that your brain even doesn't process. So I think there will be a lot of data, but what we need to harvest technology is actually try to use it for the good of that heritage and culture. And this is what we are trying to do. Not only record what did you eat today or just whom you talk to, the kind of spyware or other things. It's just about about the culture of communities, habits, practices that really help us to progress as human beings and societies. Sorry for taking long.
Okay. Can I turn to you, if I and because I know a little bit about the Nantao, and I was making the comparison. You showed an image of the slums in Kowloon, and one of the things which perhaps gives urban villages their value, in a sense, is the very presence of some heritage sites. And I know that within Nantao, I mean, I think it used to be the ancient city of Shinan, or the gateway. So you have the old, I mean, my understanding is a lot of this was destroyed by the Japanese, and then in the redevelopment in the 1980s of the city. But it's the very fact that you have the presence of some physical heritage sites, however you want to sort of configure them, that gives it its value. And of course, when you haven't got those sites, then you have maybe less value or less obvious value. And so the social capital is sort of demoted, and the aesthetic value is promoted, in a sense, in different ways. So I just wondered whether you had any reflections upon that, because it seems that some urban villages, or what we call urban villages, they are more easily gentrified than others. And in some ways, some of them are more susceptible to the pressures of neoliberalism and real estate pressures than others, precisely because of their heritage function in the past.
Yeah, thanks for your question. That's a very interesting one. I have to describe a situation or a current condition in China to you, that the very urgent mission of the urban regeneration in China is that we do not choose to demolish those urban villages. We, as your question is very foreseeing, that's what about the heritage value of the urban villages? What about its future interpretations? But in the moment, every professionals, every architect, they are just making efforts to keep that urban village. And even though some of the urban village are being gentrified, but that's kind of a normal process. And I guess in the next stage, maybe in the next decade, the policy orientation or the market force will change or influence the reuse method or the renovation method or renovation approach of urban village. I think first of all, we should maybe just to raise the awareness among all the architects or the professional to realize the value of the urban villages in Shenzhen, especially during the rapid urbanization process. So I think this certain period of time in the whole histories of China is very unique, that we have to preserve as much as possible about the physical environment and the intangible narratives, histories, or stories, or any kind of human activities. Yeah, that's the urgent mission for the moment.
Okay. I was the other thing which was just going through my mind when you were talking about, because this is a way of if you like, well, you mentioned diversifying the urban centers, but it's also a matter of sort of holding the urban center together in a sense. But I was thinking at the same time, you have this really big program of rural revitalization. And the need to regenerate the rural areas, the forgotten rural areas, because everybody moved from the rural areas to the big urban centers, and so you have a little bit of a tension there. Do you recognize that tension?
I'm not quite clear about the question you've just asked. I mean, as a matter of fact, we don't see the urban villages as rural land, because at the very beginning of the establishment of Shenzhen city, the land, the agricultural land, became urban land by the government. But the only difference is that the local villagers, they own the land use rights, so they were kept living on the land. But actually, the generations and the next generation of the local villagers, they were literally the urban inhabitants, just as the same as the migrants.
Yeah. No. The point. Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. The point I was making, it just seemed to be. There is a sort of a twin challenge in China at the moment, where you have Xi Jinping wants people to revitalize the rural regions. I wasn't suggesting these are rural regions. So there's a big push to move people back to the rural areas through the traditional villages scheme. There's a massive scheme of traditional villages. And in a sense, it's trying to sort of undo the work of cities like Shenzhen and Guangzhou, massive populations. How do you move people back to their rural roots, to the agricultural areas, which is now a real policy, important policy in China. So it was just something that was going through my mind in terms of, you know, one area you're making the city more livable and more attractive, the urban centers more attractive, and on the other side, the policy is trying to get people back to the countryside.
Yeah, that policy is quite interesting, I'd rather say, because how to say that, the fact is that the Chinese government wants to attract rural people back to their motherland. But the real situation is that the beautiful sceneries in the countryside actually attract by or appeal to middle class. And the middle class, they appreciate that kind of lifestyle in the countryside, but in a very idealistic form. But for the moment, if you want to attract the rural people back to their motherland, they are not very initiatively willing to come back, because they want to get a job, get high.
Yes, it's a big issue.
I think that will be a future picture.
Yeah. Well, I can't see other questions. Can I ask a question of both Andrew and Gamal, because I am really taken with this idea that how you are using sort of Kant with regard to establishing some sort of dare I say template for approaching heritage. And I would say that one of the things that what we need to be working for is actually deconstructing Kantian sort of a deconstruction of Kantian approaches, because this idea of the well, two things. One is, as you've said, in terms of this rationality, this sort of this human reason which Kant puts forward. That was central in the Venice Charter. It's central in the UNESCO 72 Convention for World Heritage. And of course, the other aspect of this is the aesthetics, Kant's aesthetics, which go very clearly to this. And that seems, and why that breaks down, I think, is because of this notion of universal. One of the great critiques of Kant, of course, is that there is no universal in this process. Where is the cultural? Where is the and particularly where is the emotion? And where is the emotion with heritage? This is not something, and the whole notion of intangible cultural heritage in the 2003 convention was almost a sort of a challenge to this Kantian enlightened notion that, of course, everybody had this same degree of human reason, and that it was sort of, it follows a Eurocentric sort of approach. And so I wondered what your comments were on that, because the heritage lobby, if I can use that term, has been dominated by Kantian thinking, knowingly or unknowingly, for a long period of time, and now it's been exported to the rest of the world, and it's quite strange, because it just doesn't fit with other value systems and other systems of morality, and particularly with other notions of aesthetics that are prevalent in different parts of the world. And we could look at China, or we could look at the Middle East. So I just wondered how you sort of how you saw that.
Well, I'll start off probably. I think the first thing is you could separate off the aesthetics from the reasoning side of things, in the sense that being informed by Kant, or broadly, I could equally describe it rather near Kantian as deontological, just as a broad sense, duty-based ethics. So to avoid being pulled into the aesthetic side of things. But in terms of reason, you're right. I mean, there's always been this, I suppose, battle between the Romantics and, if you like, rationalism and logic. But these things, they say it's dominated by reason. But I'd argue sort of the postmodern movement and Foucault and all the things around power structures is sort of been an antithesis to that. And these things just go in almost in waves, don't they? In the sense, the great system builders of the end of the 19th century, the Hegelians and all these sorts of people, then philosophy went into a very narrow language-based logical positivism in the 20th century. And then it swings back again and goes into another direction. So I don't think these are necessarily things that are all or nothing. I think what we're trying to do is say that in most debates around the ethics, from what I've seen, of cultural heritage, there doesn't really tend to be any sort of explicit theoretical discussion about why we ought to do these things. It's just assumed very vaguely, it's a good idea to preserve things, and that's sort of implicit, but they don't explore why. And that means, therefore, when you've got trade-offs of resources, I'm thinking probably in some times when things are utilitarian, that's sort of ignored to a degree. That everything becomes quite bland and just generally this is a good thing. And I think Kant's, particularly the categorical imperative and the idea of would we want to treat people to treat us in the way that we're treating future generations, is just a way of sort of tying it down to make it a bit more concrete.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of there was some lot of open discussion if you go back to the beginnings of the Venice Charter, and even if you go back to the Declaration of Human Rights, you know, famously the Chinese delegate had a massive argument with Eleanor Roosevelt at the time, because they said, well, you know, this is not the way we look at the world. And I think, you know, we've been caught up, and I think, and it's my big critique of the heritage movement, is that we're caught up in this this idea that you know, we ought to be doing these things because it's a good thing to do, and you know, we should be looking after the rest of humanity. But the reality is that that's not played out in different parts of the world and within different cultures and within different ethical frameworks. So there is a sort of a leap which is happening there, if you like, between the is and the ought. And you know, I like sort of some of the work of John Dewey, for instance. You know, is much more pluralistic in terms of accepting that, you know, there are different ways of seeing our past and what we do about our past. I mean, he was specifically talking about the art world, but you know, it has resonance within the heritage side of things. So I think it's you're right in a way. We need to have much more sort of surface level debates about this, you know, very explicit debates about this. But I would say that we are. Well, I'm certainly always of the view that we should be trying to sort of counteract this notion of Kantian universalism, because it just doesn't figure, and you just have to spend some time in China, or you have to spend some time in India, you know, and what you see is what is being reproduced from Europe, you know, yeah. And that to me is slightly worrying in a way, but.
Yeah, I mean, your interesting point is the leap from the is to the ought, which, you know, a lot of philosophers have highlighted that, particularly Hume. My view about it is just because you look at different moral systems around the world as an anthropologist would, that doesn't mean they're necessarily right. They're just describing, aren't you, different, as you know, different moral systems exist here to there to elsewhere, but that doesn't mean there isn't, if you like, a universal morality that one ought to move towards. And my view, I suppose, as somebody who enjoys the dialectic, is, well, throw out quite a strong thesis and see how people react to it. I think the danger is with some senses with very pragmatic type approaches, they don't really get the debate going anywhere.
If I come here for a second, just to reflect from my limited view on this kind of rhetoric, I think one thing is about the whole, what triggered this debate, Mike, is just the way that the relationship between you as a person and your responsibility towards the cultural heritage is an object or a site that you have the morality and moral duty to protect and preserve it as the accepted principle. But now in the virtual domain, if you're playing in a game, you can actually go and destroy it. You can do whatever, because it is not actually a physical object. So it's altering the relationship and appreciation of this kind of relationship between a man and an object, and how this really being two simulated experiences in the virtual domain is actually altering the ethics of behavior and attitudes. There is a number of research papers that have been evolving around the virtual reality and how people become more aggressive towards engaging with objects and scenes and virtual environments, and even against each other with the gaming industry. But there are elements of that. It's about really cultural heritage sites being transferred into that virtual domain for other purposes. And this is actually affecting and impacting the relationship and even understanding of the moral duties toward such kind of objects. So it's a kind of, we're trying to see, it's, as Andrew perhaps mentioned, it is not mean that one template fits all, but there are underlying principles that is altering this kind of relationship. And I think we wanted to look at it. Somehow we have been debating this for a few years now, and we are reaching some points where we have some clarity about where this applies, and we try to really explore. So I think it's ongoing investigation. And I think, as with all philosophies, and perhaps this argument, it's very hard to pin down a clear and definite answer. We reach it.
Well, as Andrew says, it gets the debate going in a sense, you know, which is always good. But bear in mind, you know, I mean, we're talking about digital now. We're talking about the virtual. We're talking about a mediating force. And
Yeah.
you know, I mean, and you mentioned, you brought in Benjamin because, you know, this was discussed. This you can apply this to film, you can apply this to TV, you can apply this to literature. All of these are mediators in a sense, which all carry, you know, these sorts of these moral connotations throughout. So there's nothing really new about it there as well. But you also, interestingly, you know, you mentioned that you know, the response of some groups is that, you know, it's you know, we should protect this heritage because it's our livelihood, because we can make money from it, you know. And I don't see any problem with that at all, because if that's all you've got in the world, and if you're coming from a developing country, you know, you're not preserving this because, you know, you think it's a wonderful old building, because that perception doesn't exist in other parts of the world. And again, if you think about China, where it's quite frequently, you know, people rebuild their houses every third generation, you know, and you know, can you imagine the uproar in the Cotswolds if people started doing that, you know, or in the Lake District, you know? So, so you know, I think it is, as you say, it's an ongoing debate. But I'm conscious I'm probably hogging the floor on this. So, are there any further questions or points that anybody wants to make about any of the presentations? No, there is an eerie. An eerie silence, which anyway, look, so look, I will draw this session to a close, and again, the debates run on, and you know, I think all of you have offered very interesting sort of perspectives on the digital and the role of the digital within a much wider context as well, which I think is really important to discuss. So I'd like to thank Gamal and Andrew and Yifei and Essen for their presentations, and yes, and we see you again tomorrow virtually.
Thanks a lot, Mike, for wonderful
Yeah.
mentorship.
Thank you very much. Now, thank you.
Very much.
Bye.